Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today we're making a custom TV lift cabinet with a homemade mechanism to lift the TV up and put it back down. Check it out. So to start off this project, I'm going to be building the subframe for this box out of 3/4 inch sanded plywood. And I'm just going to be ripping this down on the table saw. The idea behind this is this box was going to be wrapped in a pre-finished veneer panel that was picked out by the client from a company called KD Panels. So I figured by building the box out of 3/4 inch plywood, it would give it some nice, structural rigidity. It would keep it from warping from the paint and give it a little bit of weight so it doesn't sort of get pushed around in the room. I'm just cutting those pieces to length, and now I'm just cutting the side walls again using the same 3/4 inch plywood. And this will all be hidden by the veneer panel, so I'm still using stuff that's sanded and pretty clean, but it's really not going to be seen. So this is just nails, screws, and glue to keep the box together. Making sure those screws are sunk in nice and deep. And this gives me a little bit of room to sort of square up the box before I put the bottom on. And I'm just checking my diagonals. Whenever you're building a box, if your opposing corners, if the distance between your opposing corners is equal between opposite corners, then your box is a true square or a true rectangle. Your edges are 90 degrees. So now with the frame built, I cut out the bottom, and the bottom is going to be square, so I know if I use that as a guide as well, it'll help me keep everything square. So I'm just checking it sort of with my fingertips, put some glue on there, and nail it in with, I'm using 2-inch 18 gauge brad nails in that cordless nailer. And then I'm following up with some 1 5/8 screws just to make sure everything stays nice and tight, checking for square again, and we're good to go. So the trim on this box is going to be 2-inch by 3/4 inches thick. So I bought 1x3s, and these are clear pine, and I just ripped these all down to 2 inches so that they're all the same. And then I ripped some narrower strips for the outsides because I want the trim on the sides of the box to look equal to the trims on the large faces of the box. So I make them half as large so that the 3/4 plus that trim equals the same 2 inches that you'll see everywhere else. And with this project, I kind of just built it on the fly in terms of dimensions. I had rough dimensions that I was building to, but you're going to notice throughout this that I didn't do a lot of measuring. I like when I'm trying to keep my trim really, really tight, I like to do as much as I can on the piece and then basically mark and measure with the piece that's going to go up so that I know it's going to fit. With measuring tapes, there's always a little bit of variation, and I found it's just more precise to not measure and just to mark live on the surface to get exactly the dimensions you need. So you can see there I'm building the frame for the outside, and trying to keep the fasteners totally hidden, so I'm clamping, gluing, and nailing this from the sides in a way that won't be seen when the box is actually fully assembled. And I'll be making 2 of these frames, one for each side, going through the same exact process. And this one had a couple little nails pop out, so I just set those in with a little nail punch, and I'll fill those holes later. Something I decided to do now was just put the whole box up on some 2x4 blocks And this actually allows the legs that I'm building for it to sort of float, which keeps me away from any variation that might be in my tabletop. This table's starting to warp a little bit, so I'm going to have to be rebuilding it. So I wanted to keep the bench box from becoming warped because the table's out. And you saw just there I pulled out a belt sander and just sort of sanded away some rough spots. But with these side panels done, I clamped them onto the subframe and then screw them in from the back with some 1 1/4" screws. And this keeps them in place. So now I'm going to be building the long face trims. And it's the same process. It's going to be the 2-inch material on the top and the sides on these, because they're going to be butting up against those thinner pieces of trim on the small sides, and they're going to look all continuous throughout. So what's nice about this with the 3/4 inch thick material is I have the opportunity to really easily clamp this whole thing together before I actually fasten anything. This whole piece needs to be painted, except for obviously the veneer panel that I'm using. And I really try not to paint any of my projects. I'm not a great painter, and it just stresses me out. I just feel like it's not something that I'm good enough at to really feel 100% comfortable with. So I try and minimize the amount of risk when I paint. So the reason that I'm building this whole thing, instead of just applying these trims right to the box, is I want to paint this whole thing before I install the veneer panel so that I don't have any risk of getting paint on the veneer panels. So speaking of the veneer panels, what I'm doing right now is I'm basically routering in a recess for the veneer panel to sit so that it is recessed in the back side of the trims that I just made. So the veneer panels are about 1/4 inch, and I don't have a dado insert for my saw stop. So instead of setting up a dado blade, I just did a couple of passes with my regular blade, and that gave me enough depth that I could go in with a knife and just sort of cut that away. And I'm only doing this on the long side, and the other sides I'm going to do with a router later. But before I assemble these, I wanted to have those long sides done. And I'm using the Craig jig. This is a K3, I think. And just putting 2 pocket screws in the long sides of the large face trims. And these will just keep everything nice and tight, keep them from shifting around. There's also going to be glue and some nails in there as well. And like I said, everything's going to be screwed and basically attached to that subframe in the end. But since I'm going to have to be handling it while I'm painting it and finishing it, I want to make sure that everything is nice and solid and I don't have anything fall apart on me. So you can see here, I'm just using a little square to make sure that the legs are the same, putting in those pocket screws. And you can see sort of in the background how the leg is floating off the bench top. And once I'm all done, this piece will sit on the floor. But for now, while I'm working on it, it's nice to have it sort of floating up off the ground. And again, I can get some clamps in there and sort of clamp this thing together, make sure everything's going to fit together nice. And you can see how the panel sits in there and it's nice and flush. So I have to make one more of these big face frames for the other side. And once that's done, I can take the box off the table. And at this point, everything is temporarily screwed on from the inside, and it's time to get working on the sort of main purpose of this box is this TV lift. So as I said in the intro, I had to sort of make a TV lift for this, and while I was designing it, I had some trouble figuring out a way to have the TV recess deep enough in the cabinet and also stick up high enough when the cabinet is open. So after doing some modeling in SketchUp and sort of figuring some stuff out, I decided that I really needed a double extension drawer slide, and I couldn't really find anything that I thought would work well. So what I wound up doing was I bought 2 14-inch drawer slides, and I thought if I were to weld them together, then I can get that double extension that I need to get me the right amount of height, but also the right amount of recess when the cabinet is closed. So you'll see here I just ground away some of that zinc coating, and I'm just putting some tack welds in the holes They're more or less plug welds in the holes that the screws would go in. So the idea here is that I need to keep this footprint height-wise, but I need the maximum extension I can get. So what I just did there and explained, welded the two slides together. So now I can extend this one and then extend this one. So I get this double extension drawer slide. And I know this is something that exists. I just kind of didn't think of it till the last minute, so I had to sort of make my own. But this, I think, is going to work really well. So we can get back to the rest of it now. So with those double extension drawer slides set up, now I can go to basically making a mount for the back of the TV. Originally I was going to try and make this out of sheet metal, but I figured with mounting the drawer slides it would have just been easier to make it out of wood. And this first one that I'm making is more or less a template. The screws that I'm using I'm going to have to counterbore in because they're not that long. So that's why I did the little bit of Forstner bit first and then the through hole afterwards. And now I'm just cutting down the screws to be the correct length. I don't want to make the back side of this very bulky, but you can see there's sort of a notch in the bottom side of the TV. Now this actually is the client's TV that I'm working with here. So once I get the two sidebars in the correct position, I put some blocking on this in order to make a more solid mounting bracket for the back of the TV. And eventually this is going to be made out of 3/4 inch plywood. So I start to lay out the holes that I already drilled in those pieces of scrap wood onto some plywood, cut that up, and drill the holes, screw it back into the back of the TV. And then I add an additional piece so that I can clear that little bump on the bottom. And now this winds up being temporary. I wound up remaking this entire thing because it just really wasn't exactly what I needed. Now this project had a lot of these little sort of redos as I was going. Not really sure why. I did a lot of planning prior to building this. It just sort of was one of those things where, you know, stuff I was building was an inch off, or, you know, I didn't take into account for length of the drawer slide or the pin. So it's all right. It's something you learn from and you kind of build off of. So these blocks that I'm building right now are just to space the drawer slides off the inside of the cabinet so that the TV is a little more centered in the cabinet, not so far away. And those are just 2x4s. They're screwed and glued together, and I'm just ripping down the sides to get that rounded edge off and make them nice and square. And I drilled some countersinks in those so that the 3-inch screws that I'm using can get into the 3/4 inch plywood but not go through the other end. Then I'm just screwing those into the box. Now I can install the drawer slides on the back of the TV, and then using a block and some clamps I can get the drawer slides attached to those big blocks and sort of get the first test run of this and make sure that it's actually going to work. It's a little tight to get in there with the drill, but this was the first time I assembled this. I probably took this in and out 10 or 15 times over the course of this project. So by the time I was done, I was an expert. You can see I'm just using that stick to temporarily hold it up. And the proof of concept was sort of there at this point, and I knew I could keep moving.
Many hours later.
So you might notice these got taller. What I realized was that in order to latch this properly underneath here, that these would need to be full height. So I went ahead and I made new posts. These are 2x4s that are planed, glued and screwed together. And now we've got this plate, and this plate's going to go on there and allow me a place for the locking pin to get underneath there. So we can put this on. Temporarily, I'm just using this gate pin. I'm eventually there's gonna be a spring pin. I just have to get it. I had ordered online. So with that all set up, I spent some time sort of looking at the TV mount and decided that the bracket that I had made out of plywood wasn't going to work, and decided to make another one. This will be the third one. And this one I wanted to put a finger groove in so you could more easily lift the TV. You'll see I'm drilling with a Forstner bit right here to make the groove, and I had the two pieces of plywood still screwed together, and then I get in here with a knife and a router. For some reason, I thought I could avoid taking these pieces apart, which was just a mistake. So I wound up, after doing all this chisel work and trying to do this basically blind finger groove, I wound up just separating those two pieces of material and really getting in there to sand it nice. But here I'm just putting a little round over on it. And then you can see here they are separated, and I go over to the spindle sander and just sort of clean up the inside of that and hand sand it a little bit. Like I said, this project, I just kept having to make and remake everything. So with that done, I finally glued these two pieces together, got some screws in there to make it nice and tight, and you can see those recessed holes again for the screws mounting to the TV. Countersunk some more screws in there just to make sure this thing never goes anywhere, and threw some clamps on the top while the glue set up. Once it was all done, I mounted it back to the TV, and you can see it's kind of the cleanest version of the bracket that I had made so far. And just sort of giving it another test fit. So with that work with the TV completed, it was time to work on these panels. So I grabbed my router, and there's a rabbiting bit on there with a guide bearing, and I just run it around the insides of the face frames. And you can see on here the long sides are already done because I did that on the table saw earlier. So I'm just sort of chasing that depth with the router. And then since the router leaves you round corners, I just had to go back in there with a chisel and square up those corners on all four of the face frames. And sometimes I'll round over the inset on a project like this, but here I just wanted to keep those corners nice and square. And now I'm just taking my measurements for the panel that's going to be inside, and I want to keep these pretty tight. So I'm just sort of measuring, and at this point I've numbered all the panels, and now I'm making just a little cut list, and I'll cut the pieces and then number the pieces as I cut them, and they'll go in their corresponding panels. So here's that veneer sheet. It looks pretty shiny because it's currently covered in a plastic that comes from the manufacturer. It's like a sticky protective plastic. And I'm just setting up my tracks. And breaking down this material is pretty easy with the track saw. I have a 1 1/4 inch piece of Ridgid foam on the table, and that's basically like my cutting substrate. So what's nice is I can cut right through the material. It also keeps things relatively flat because the foam is so thick. It keeps everything nice and square. The veneer panel is a little wavy, but that's just because it's so thin and light. And I'm just going through with my track and with all my marks with my cut list. And since the kerf of the blade runs to the outside of the track, I can bring my track right up to my line, and I don't have to worry about the kerf of the blade affecting the size of the panel that I'm cutting. So it's a nice thing about working with a track saw. This would have been pretty difficult material to pass through the table saw accurately because it's so light and so flexible. To do it by myself, this sort of lightweight material can actually be pretty dangerous. You got a good chance of kickback, and you can kind of like fly all over the place. So with this, there were no splinters. Everything came out really nice and square, and the panels fit perfectly inside there based on the measurements that I had gotten. So with the panels done, I just do sort of a test fit on the box one more time, and that's in order for me to make the lid. At this point, I've just built the panels on the sides, but the lids are going to be more or less exactly the same thing. I wanted to make sure everything was sort of good to go before I fabricated the lid. So with the 1 1/4 inch screws, the panels all go back on, and then I can fabricate up the lid and make sure it's going to fit right. At that point, it's just clamped together. It's good to go. I label all my sides, and then I can do my field assembly of the panels. So what I decided to do was I decided to assemble the panels off of the box. There's enough of a clearance that I know they'll slide back in over. And like I said before, the purpose behind this was basically because of my inability to paint well. My thought was that if I assembled these panels beforehand, then I can paint everything, basically get the shell of the box completely finished, and then slide it over the frame, and I'll be good to go. So I also wanted to avoid using fasteners to put it together because I didn't want those to show up. So I'm just using glue and clamps to keep the frame together. Checking to make sure everything's nice and square. The 3/4 material lends itself to the clamps really well, and it works well to keep this thing tight while the glue sets up. So I leave this overnight to dry to make sure everything sets up really nicely. And now that it's all glued up, I try the top on there again. It's the next day. I had some tape covering up a couple of little areas, and now it's just on to sanding. I decided to try out this sandpaper that I had found at Home Depot. It was pretty good. I read good things about it. It doesn't clog up. It's like a mesh sandpaper for wood. So since everything was already dressed, it's S4S material, I just started with 220 and it gave me like a really sort of smooth finish. I eased all the edges, and then I do my first test fit. Everything fit together pretty nice. It was a pretty good fit on the box, not super tight. And with that on there, I decided I would lay out my hinges before I do my priming and painting. Now these hinges I'm using are 270 overlay hinges, and they're from Rockler. And they were the only type of hinge I could find that would allow this lid to go completely over and lay flat on the back side of the box. And that was a feature that the client had asked for specifically. She didn't want to see the inside of the lid by having it, rest in a vertical position, and she didn't want it to take up too much room. So these 270 hinges give a really nice action. You can just roll them completely over, and the box still looks nice and finished even when it's open. Now these are supposed to be no mortise hinges. You're supposed to just put them directly on your panels, but what I found was that in order to really get this thing to close tight, I had to mortise them in. So later on I wind up doing some chiseling and routering to get them together. So with everything sort of conceptualized and I know it works, it was on to the painting. This is by far my least favorite part. I used a bare wood primer, came from Sherwin-Williams, and it was just to sort of knock down any of those grain patterns or any of the tannins from the wood from coming through the white paint once it was done. So I primed everything with the white, and then I covered it in a semi-gloss pure white paint. So something about the painting of this is, if you paint one side of a piece of plywood, it tends to warp towards that side. I was really worried about this piece warping from the paint, so I made sure to paint every surface inside and outside of everything to try and minimize the warping that I might have. And I also spray painted the bracket with a semi-flat black. Something I wanted to add to the bracket was an aluminum strip so that the spring pin that rides up and down it could run on some metal instead of scratching up the wood. So I just took a piece of 16th inch thick aluminum and I drilled and countersank some holes into it, and I screwed it on to the back of that bracket. And this will just give that pin something nice to ride against. I'm sort of painting this cyclically around the shop. I'm painting the box, then the lid, and at this point I'm ready to inset the first panel. Now this is into the lid. So I check everything, make sure it all fits nice and tight, lay that panel in there, and then I start stapling it in. These are T50 staples. So I'm not using any glue to keep the panel in. I kind of want it to be able to move a little bit if it wants to. So I'm just using these staples in there that'll give enough of a hold to keep it stable. And the reason that I had to do the lid sort of first was because I have to paint the back of the lid so that when it's open it still looks nice and white. So I prime it and then paint it with the semi-gloss paint that the rest of the box is getting. So I was pretty sparing with the amount of staples that I used in these. I kind of wanted them to be able to get a little bit of movement. If the cabinet wants to move, I'd rather them move with it instead of break. So I'm just laying these in, and again, they're all numbered, so I know exactly what's got to go where. And the other thing too is that this whole assembly has to slip over that box. So the 4 staples that I'm putting in there are more than enough to keep these in place once the pressure of them around the box is sort of applied on them. And now with the combination of the paint and those panels, getting this exterior frame on there was a lot more difficult than it was when it was empty. So having a second person right now would have probably saved me some time and some frustration, but a little bit of persuasion, a tap here and a tap there, it eventually made its way down. I'm also trying to be really gentle so that I don't just totally blow this thing apart. So now with the exterior frame on there, everything's nice and tight and lined up, I can put in the final screws that I'm going to be using. And these are, again, they're 1¼ inch, so that's 3/4 of an inch of plywood and then 3/4 an inch of trim. And those 1¼ inch sunk in will get just the right amount of hold to keep everything nice. I put in some little side panels over here to give that lid something to rest on when it's closed. And since I already had installed the hinges, they'll go back in the exact same spots. I can do sort of my final assembly of the bracket on the back of the TV. You can see it with that aluminum strip installed. I can put my drawer slides back on there. And do sort of my final installation of the drawer slides inside the box. I had already had holes basically set up from when I had installed these previously, so everything went back in exactly the same way. But now I had taken these drawer slides in and out about 10 times, so I was an expert in clamping them and using the block as a spacer. Now that that's done, I can put in that spring pin. I put 1 screw in to start just to make sure it's all lined up, and then I pre-drill and add the 2nd screw. You can see that little plate that's on the top of the bracket, and that's there so that when the lid is closed, it sits nice and flush. My concern was that somebody was going to wind up sitting on this thing and then just going right through it. So I figured I would leverage the strength of that bracket to add a little bit more support when the lid is closed. I couldn't make the lid any thicker because I needed it to be a certain height, and the constraints were very tight on this project. So you had to use everything that I sort of could to keep it structurally strong, but also accomplish all the goals. overall, I was really happy with how it came out. Just requires one hand to lift it up and then a second hand to undo that pin and put the TV back down.
Thanks for watching. Again, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything. If you have any questions about any of the processes that I did in this build or anything about the shop, leave them in the comments down below. If you want to see some behind the scenes stuff about what goes on here at Make Everything, follow us on Instagram at Make Everything Shop. And I've got some new Make Everything gear up in the web store, some hoodies, crew necks, and hats. So check that stuff out. There's a link down in the description. I really enjoyed this project as much as it fought me all the way through. But, you know, these kind of challenging projects, they give you the tools and the information that you need to go on and do the next thing and accomplish it that much better. We recently opened a Patreon account too. If you're interested in helping support the shop, I got a couple of reward tiers on there. Any little bit helps to keep the lights on and to keep us doing this sort of stuff. We also teach classes in woodworking and welding here. So if you're interested in any of that, drop us a line. And again, I appreciate you watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.